The crack in the sandstone was barely wide enough for a boy's shoulders. Levi Vale pressed his palm flat against the rock, warm from the afternoon sun, and peered into the dark beyond the door. A real wooden door, set into the cliff face like something out of a dream. Behind him, his brothers hadn't moved. 3 weeks earlier, none of them had believed it. Their father, Ephraim Vale, had spent the last years of his life building something in silence, and he had never said a word about it to a single soul in Juniper Crossing. Most men leave their sons a debt, a name, or a memory. Ephraim Vale left his sons a mountain. The question was whether they were ready to live inside one. Juniper Crossing was not a bad town. It had a dry goods store, a livery, a post office, and a woman named Mrs. Holt who made exceptional rye bread on Thursdays. For 2 years, the Vale brothers had rented a pair of rooms above the feed merchant's warehouse. 3 boys in a tight space smelling of oats and dust, with a single window facing the alley. Gideon, 19, had managed everything since their father fell ill. He kept the ledger. He paid the landlord. He made sure Levi got to the schoolroom 3 mornings a week when there was a teacher to run it. He had the kind of face that looked older than it should, with a set to his jaw that came from carrying things alone. Micah, 16, was the sort of boy who could not sit still and would not be quiet. He had opinions about everything. The best way to stack firewood, which mule at the livery was worth trusting, whether the clouds were bringing rain or just passing through. He was almost always right, which made him difficult to argue with, and occasionally insufferable. Levi, 12, was different from both of them. He noticed things. He had a habit of crouching beside the road to study a beetle or pressing his ear to a fence post to hear what the wind was doing on the other side. He was the one who had cried openly at their father's burial, and he was the one who had asked the minister afterward whether a man's work outlasted him. The minister had said yes, in the eyes of the Lord. Levi had nodded as though filing it away for later. Their father had died in February, quietly, in the back room of the town doctor's house. He had been sick most of the previous year, and the end, when it came, felt like a door closing at the far end of a long hall. He had left almost nothing behind that they could see, which was why, 3 weeks later, the lawyer's letter changed everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was written in a neat, careful hand and directed to Gideon Vale, eldest son, care of the feed merchant. Inside was a single page from a man named Aldous Fry, acting as executor of Ephraim Vale's estate. It informed Gideon that his father had left a will, that the will included a deed, and that the deed was for a property located approximately 4 miles east of Juniper Crossing, in the Sandstone Canyon country, along the base of the Copper Vale ridgeline. There was also a banknote for $62, drawn against a small savings account none of them had known existed. At the bottom of the letter, in different ink, older ink, perhaps written some time before the rest, were 7 words in their father's handwriting. Go there. Stay. It is yours. Micah read the letter twice, then set it on the table and looked at Gideon the way he looked at things he suspected were trying to fool him. He owned land out in the canyon country and never once mentioned it. That's what it says, Gideon replied. For how long? The letter doesn't say. Micah leaned back in his chair. Their room above the feed merchant was only large enough for a table, 2 chairs, and 3 cots stacked in shifts. The window behind him let in the sound of the street, a wagon, a dog, someone calling out a price for something. It's probably a hole, Micah said. Some dry notch in a cliff face that he bought off a mining outfit for nothing. That's what canyon country out east is. Holes and rock and nothing much else. He left us $62, Levi said from his cot. He had read the letter first, silently, before either of his brothers got to it. $62 doesn't mean the land is worth anything, Micah said. He might have just had that saved up. Gideon folded the letter and set it beside the lamp. He was quiet for a moment. He had the habit of going quiet when he was working something through, and his brothers had learned not to interrupt that particular silence. "We're behind on rent," he said finally. 2 weeks. I've been borrowing against the next odd job to keep us square, but there isn't another job lined up. Neither of his brothers spoke. "If we go out there and it's nothing, a dry crack in the rock with no water and no soil, we come back and we figure something else out. We use the $62 to get ahead of ourselves for once." He looked at Micah first, then at Levi. "But we have to go look." Micah drummed his fingers once on the table, then stopped. "Fine," he said, "but when it's a hole, I want it noted that I said it would be a hole." Levi was already sitting up on the edge of his cot, his boots in his hand. "I don't think it's a hole," he said, and began pulling them on. They settled their rent, packed what they owned into 2 canvas sacks and a wooden crate, and left Juniper Crossing on a clear morning in the first week of April. The town did not make much of their leaving. Mrs. Holt waved from her doorway. The feed merchant took back the key without looking up from his ledger. The road east wound out of the settlement and into open country, red rock rising slow on either side, the canyon walls getting taller the farther they walked. Gideon carried the crate. Micah carried both sacks. Levi walked ahead of them, reading the ground like a map. None of them looked back. The presence they were walking toward had no voice and no face. But Ephraim Vale was with them in every step of that road. He had been a quiet man, not cold, but careful. He measured words the way he measured timber, only as much as the job required. The boys had known him as steady, as reliable, as the kind of father who showed up. What they had not known was that he had been building something for them in secret for years. They were only now beginning to understand the size of that. The canyon widened and narrowed in turns, the sandstone walls shifting color as the morning light moved over them, burnt orange in the shadows, pale gold where the sun hit clean. The trail was not much of a trail, more of a suggestion, a worn-down line in the red dirt that might have been made by deer or by a single man walking the same path many times over many years. Micah had the deed and the rough hand-drawn map that had come tucked inside the back of the envelope. He kept consulting it, frowning, turning it in different directions. "He drew it himself," Micah said. "You can tell by the way the lines aren't quite straight." "Can you read it?" Gideon asked. "More or less. There should be a split in the canyon wall around the next bend. 2 formations that look like a doorframe, according to this." Levi, who had been ranging a few yards ahead of them the whole morning, called back without turning around. "I see it." They rounded the bend and stopped. The canyon wall to the south had fractured at some point in the long past, a great vertical split in the rock face, running from the ground up farther than any of them could reasonably measure with their eyes. The 2 sides of the split stood apart by perhaps 30 feet at the base, narrowing as they rose, and between them the light fell differently. Softer, more contained. But that was not what stopped them. In front of the cliff, running along the base of the rock for a length of perhaps 40 feet, was a garden. Not the wild scrub of the canyon floor. A real garden. Raised beds framed in flat stones, the dark soil inside them turned recently enough that the surface still held its texture. Rows of small green starts were pushing up in careful lines, lettuce in tight curls, the broad pale leaves of young cabbages, the thin shoots of onions spaced with intention. At the far end, where the cliff face caught the most afternoon sun, a row of young tomato plants had been set into the earth, each one staked with a thin branch tied with a strip of cotton cloth. In the shadowed corner at the base of one rock formation, a small patch of old snow still clung in a half-moon shape, white and stubborn. Everything else was green. Micah stood very still. He said nothing for longer than was ordinary for him. Levi walked straight to the edge of the nearest garden bed and crouched down, pressing 2 fingers gently into the dark soil, the way he had seen farmers do at the market in town. He looked up at his brothers with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite wonder, something between the two. "It's been watered," he said. "Recently." "How recently?" Gideon asked. "Day before yesterday, maybe. The surface is dry, but underneath it's still damp." Gideon looked around the canyon. There was no visible stream, but the air near the cliff base was noticeably cooler than the open canyon floor. And at the foot of the rock wall, where the soil was dark and heavy, he thought he could see the faint track of water spreading outward from somewhere beneath the stone. "There's a spring," he said. Micah finally moved. He walked the length of the garden slowly, reading it the way he read the map. Seriously, with his full attention. He stopped at the tomato plants and looked at the cotton ties on the stakes. They had been knotted neatly, tight enough to hold, loose enough not to cut into the stem. "He was out here," Micah said quietly. "Not just building. He was out here tending this. All winter." Gideon did not answer. His throat had tightened in a way he had not expected and was not entirely prepared to manage in front of his brothers. He turned toward the cliff face and looked at the 2 cracks in the rock. "Let's see what's inside," he said. The first crack, the narrower one, on the left, was just wide enough for a man's shoulders if he turned sideways through the entrance. But that entrance opened almost immediately into something else entirely. The space inside was not large, but it was a room. Whoever had cut and fitted the stone wall that filled the gap between the natural rock faces had known exactly what they were doing. The front wall was sandstone block, laid in careful courses, with a solid wooden door set into a frame of rough timber. The door had a latch, a simple iron one, and it swung inward without protest. Inside, the ceiling was the canyon stone itself, low, arching overhead, but tall enough to stand upright without ducking. The floor had been leveled with packed clay and covered in places with worn planking. Along the left wall, built-in wooden shelves ran nearly the full length of the room, stacked with folded blankets, a tin lantern, a box of candles, an iron pot, 2 pans, and a row of sealed glass jars, some containing dried beans, some containing what appeared to be preserved fruit, a dark, rich color through the glass. 3 rope-frame beds were arranged along the back wall, each one fitted with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, each one made up with a blanket folded at the foot. The middle bed was larger than the others. A stack of firewood, cut to length and split, sat in the corner beside a small stone hearth built into the natural rock. The chimney ran up through a crack in the ceiling. Old soot marks on the stone above it showed that it drew well. Micah stood in the doorway and did not come all the way inside for a long moment. "He built this," he said. It was not a question. His voice had changed quality. The skeptical edge he had carried all morning was gone. "Over years," Gideon said. He was standing at the shelves, touching one of the glass jars lightly. "Look at the jars." He was stocking it. Levi had gone straight to the smallest bed and sat down on the edge of it. He pressed both hands flat against the blanket and looked at the room. The shelves, the lantern, the stacked wood, the hearth. with the careful, cataloging attention that was his habit. He knew which one would be mine, Levi said. Neither of his brothers asked how he knew that. The smallest bed was against the wall nearest the door, and the blanket on it was the one with the dark blue stripe, the one from their old house, the one Levi had always slept under. Gideon walked out of the room and down the cliff face to the second crack, the wider one, 30 feet farther along the rock. Micah followed. Levi came last, trailing his fingers along the sandstone wall. The second crack opened into a space that was larger, rougher, and smelled strongly of straw and dry rock. It was higher ceilinged than the first, the natural cleft wider at the base, and someone had laid a thick bed of clean straw across the floor. A manger had been built against one wall, timber and stone, solid and practical. Iron rings were set into the rock on either side of it, each one bolted into a drilled hole. Overhead, a gap in the rock let in a column of pale sky. It was a barn, carved out of the mountain, straw-floored and warm-walled and ready. "The $62, Micah said. "Goats," Gideon said. Micah looked at the manger, the rings, the straw. He put his hand against the rock wall, still holding the morning's warmth, insulated from the wind. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely unlike his usual one, he thought of everything. Gideon looked at the barn, and then at the garden outside, and then at the narrow door of the living quarters, where Levi had reappeared, standing in the frame with afternoon light behind him. "Yes," Gideon said. He did. They slept in the cliff house that first night. Gideon lit the lantern and hung it from the ceiling hook. Micah found the flint and got a small fire going in the hearth. Levi was asleep before the fire had settled into coals, the blue striped blanket pulled to his chin. Gideon sat up a while after the others, the lantern low, the stone walls warm around him. He opened the small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket and wrote at the top of a clean page, "Not a hole." Below it, he wrote 2 more words, then closed the notebook and did not open it again that night. The problem, as it turned out, was not the place. The place was extraordinary. Every day, they found something new in it. A niche cut into the rock above the hearth that was exactly the right size for the tin lantern. A drainage channel carved along the base of the garden beds that directed rainwater toward the roots without flooding them. A flat ledge outside the barn entrance where a man could sit and watch the canyon in the late afternoon when the light turned everything amber. The problem was that they did not yet know how to live in it. Gideon had spent 2 years managing town life, paying the landlord, keeping track of what they owed at the dry goods counter, navigating the small social architecture of Juniper Crossing. He knew how to make life work inside a system someone else had built. Out here, there was no system. There was only what they made. The first week exposed the gaps. They had enough dried stores in the jars to last perhaps 3 weeks if they were careful, but the garden was too young to harvest from yet. The cabbages needed another month at minimum, and the tomatoes far longer. They had no meat, no eggs, no milk. They had the $62, which was enough to buy goats and supplies in Juniper Crossing. But Gideon was reluctant to spend it all at once without a plan for what came after. Micah wanted to go into town immediately and buy 2 goats, a milking doe and a young buck, and argued that the milk alone would change their circumstances within the week. Gideon thought they should study the situation longer before committing the money. The argument went on for 2 evenings and raised the temperature in the small stone room in ways that had nothing to do with the hearth. "You're treating that $62 like it's sacred," Micah said on the second evening. "It's not sacred. It's working capital. Father didn't save it so you could sit on it. I'm not sitting on it. I'm thinking. You've been thinking for 5 days. Levi, from his corner, said quietly, The doe needs to be milking already. A young one won't give milk for months. We need one that's already been freshened. Both brothers looked at him. I asked the man at the livery in town once, when we were waiting for the farrier, Levi said, with the mild expression of someone reporting nothing more than a fact. He had goats for a while. He said the thing most people get wrong is buying young when they need milk now. Micah pointed at Levi with a vindicated expression. He's 12, Gideon said. He's right, Micah replied. Gideon looked at his youngest brother for a moment, then picked up the notebook. He wrote something, crossed it out, wrote something else. 1 freshened doe and 1 doeling, he said finally. The doe gives us milk now. The doeling is the next year's start. We spend $30 on the animals and use the rest for flour, salt, oil, and any tools we're missing. Micah exhaled. That's what I said. It's what Levi said, Gideon replied, and there was something in his tone that was not quite humor, but lived close to it. The harder trouble, though, was not the goats. It was Gideon himself. He was waking in the night and lying stiff on his cot, listening to the canyon wind, turning questions over in the dark. He was not afraid of work. He was afraid of being the one responsible for this, alone, with no one to answer to and no one to catch them if he chose wrong. They went to Juniper Crossing on a Thursday. The town felt different when you were visiting it rather than living in it. Smaller somehow. The street seemed narrower. Gideon noticed the way the buildings pressed together along the main road, all of them dependent on each other's walls, the whole row holding itself up by mutual agreement. He had not thought about that before. At the dry goods store, the merchant's wife looked at them with curiosity. Thought you boys had moved on, she said. We're out in the canyon country now, Micah said. Our father left us a homestead. The woman raised her eyebrows. Ephraim Vale had a homestead out there? She said it in the tone of someone discovering that a familiar thing was not quite what they had thought. He did, Gideon said. Is it livable? Very much so, Levi said, with a confidence that surprised both his brothers and apparently the woman behind the counter, who looked at the smallest Vale boy and then smiled in a way that suggested she believed him. They bought flour, salt, cooking oil, dried corn, a new axe handle to replace the cracked one they had found in the storage niche, and a length of rope. Gideon tallied everything twice and paid from the folded bills he kept in his breast pocket. Micah carried the sacks. The goats came from a farm a half-mile outside of town, kept by a couple named the Aldermans, who had more animals than their pasture comfortably held. The doe was 4 years old, white with brown ears, already producing well. The doeling was 2 months old, skittish and compact, and surprisingly determined about where she did and did not want to walk. Getting them back to the canyon was an education. The doe walked calmly enough on a lead rope. The doeling spent the first mile attempting to eat the lead rope, the second mile sitting down at intervals and refusing to proceed, and the third mile discovering that she could keep pace with a 12-year-old boy if she was positioned just behind his left knee. Levi, who had taken charge of her without being asked, adjusted his pace to hers and spoke to her in a low, patient voice the entire way. By the time the canyon walls rose on either side of them, she was trotting alongside him with an air of having decided the arrangement was acceptable. Micah watched this and said nothing, which for Micah was a form of high respect. At the cliff house, they led both animals through the wider crack into the barn. The doe walked in, investigated the manger, and began to eat straw. The doeling walked in, spun in a circle, and pressed herself against the warm rock wall, with an expression of complete satisfaction. Gideon stood in the barn entrance and looked at the space his father had built, the iron rings, the manger, the deep straw floor, and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what his father had known. He had not built a barn as an afterthought. He had built it first. He had known his boys would need animals before they needed almost anything else, and he had made the space ready and waiting years before any of them arrived to use it. That night, Gideon sat at the edge of his cot for a long time after Micah and Levi were asleep. He was not anxious in the way he had been, but something was pressing at the back of his thoughts. Something he hadn't named yet, something that felt unfinished. And he could not quite settle. On the fourth morning after the goats arrived, Gideon went to do the milking alone and found the doe standing oddly at the back of the barn, away from the manger, her ears down. He knew enough about animals to feel the wrongness of it immediately. He examined her as carefully as he could, her legs, her belly, the color of her gums. He could not find an obvious cause, but she would not eat, and she would not drink, and the look in her eyes was dull in a way that hollowed his stomach. He stood in the barn doorway and thought, if we lose her, we lose the milk. If we lose the milk, we are back to the beginning. He did not tell his brothers right away. He sat outside on the flat ledge by the barn entrance and looked out at the canyon for a long time, the morning light stretching down the rock walls in slow degrees. He thought about his father. He thought about the years Ephraim had come out here alone, building, planting, stocking the shelves, tying the cotton strips to the tomato stakes, and he tried to understand what it had cost him. Not money, the other currency, the quiet decision, made over and over, to build something for people who did not yet know they needed it. Gideon had spent 2 years being the one who held things together by force, managing, calculating, staying one step ahead of the next problem. He had done it out of love, he supposed, but also out of a kind of fear, the fear that if he was not watching every edge, everything would slip. His father had not built this place out of fear. He had built it out of trust. Trust that the land would hold. Trust that the spring would keep running. Trust that his sons, when the time came, would be equal to what they found. Gideon looked at his hands. He did not have to carry this alone. He never had. He had simply gotten used to acting as if he did. He stood up and went to get his brothers. They examined the doe together. Levi sat with her in the straw, stroking the flat of her nose, watching her breathing. Micah checked the water trough and found a rind of green growth along the rim he had missed when he filled it the day before. He scrubbed it out and refilled it from the spring. Contaminated water, he said. That's my guess. Nothing worse. It took most of the day, but by late afternoon the doe was eating again. Gideon watched his brothers work and said simply, "Thank you." May came in slowly, the way the best things do. The canyon warmed by degrees, the red walls holding the heat longer each afternoon, the mornings still cool enough to make the work pleasant. The garden, which had looked thin and hopeful in early April, was now something different, lush and purposeful. The rows of cabbages broad and dark green, the lettuce sending up full heads, the onion tops feathering out above the soil in thick clusters. The tomato plants had climbed past their stakes, and Gideon had cut new ones from willow branches at the canyon floor, tying them with strips from an old flour sack. Levi had named the doe Millicent and the doeling Pip, and neither name was up for debate. Millicent had recovered fully and was producing nearly 3 quarts of milk a day. Levi had appointed himself head of milking operations, rising each morning before his brothers and coming back inside with the pail covered by a cloth, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had found their work and recognized it. He kept a small notebook now. Gideon had given him one from the leather satchel their father's lawyer had forwarded along with the deed, and in it he tracked the milk yield by day, the weather, the height of the cabbage heads, the behavior of the plants. Micah had taken over the physical structure of the place with an energy that surprised no one who knew him. Within the first 2 weeks of May, he had repointed the mortar on 2 courses of the front wall where the winter freeze had worked it loose, reinforced the barn door with a length of strap iron, and extended the drainage channel in the garden beds another 6 feet to capture the runoff from a new direction. He had also, without announcing it, built a small stone bench along the south-facing wall of the cliff home, positioned to catch the last of the evening light. He never sat on it himself. It was the right height for Levi. Gideon repaired things. He fixed what was broken, made what was worn serviceable again, and spent the long evenings sitting at the small table inside the cliff room with the ledger open, working out a plan. It was not a plan for survival, exactly. Survival, it turned out, was already handled. Had been handled, in fact, before any of them arrived. What Gideon was working out was a plan for forward, what the goat herd could become in 3 years, what portion of the garden could be expanded to produce a surplus worth carrying to town, what a second season of careful stocking might build up in the shelves. He wrote numbers and crossed them out and wrote better ones, and slowly, across many evenings, a picture assembled itself. They were not trying to get through. They were building something. He recognized the feeling. He had seen it once before, in his father, in the early years before his mother passed. That particular quality of attention a man gives to things he intends to keep. On a Friday afternoon in the middle of May, a man named Mr. Alderman, the farmer they had bought the goats from, rode out to the canyon country on an unrelated errand and found his way to the cliff face. He had heard from his wife about Ephraim Vale's homestead, and curiosity had finally gotten the better of him. He stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the stone wall of the cliff home, at the door set neatly into its frame, at the barn crack farther along the rock. "Your father built all this himself?" he said. "Yes, sir," Gideon said. "Over how long?" "We're not certain. At least 4 years, we think. Maybe longer." Alderman took off his hat and turned it in his hands. He was a practical man, not given to excessive admiration, but something in his expression suggested he was recalculating something. "He was a patient man," Alderman said. "He was," Gideon agreed. "This soil—" Alderman walked along the edge of the nearest bed, looking at the dark earth without touching it. "There's a spring feeding this, isn't there? Underneath." "Yes, sir. It comes out at the base of the rock and spreads under the bed on the south side." Alderman nodded slowly. Natural irrigation, and the cliff wall reflecting heat onto the beds from the south. He put his hat back on. "That's why the tomatoes are as far along as they are. Warmer microclimate. Your father knew what he was doing when he laid this out." He stayed another half hour, asking practical questions about the drainage and the barn construction, and when he rode away, he shook Gideon's hand with a firmness that felt like a different kind of acknowledgement than mere courtesy. That evening, all 3 brothers sat outside on the canyon floor in front of the cliff face as the light left the sky. Millicent was in the barn. Pip had, characteristically, found her way out through some margin of the door and was standing a few feet away, looking at the garden with the expression of an animal that would very much like to eat it, and was only refraining out of a complex, ongoing negotiation with Levi. The canyon walls rose above them, the sandstone holding the last pink of the sky, the first stars appearing over the eastern rim. Micah said after a long quiet, "I want to add another garden bed this summer, on the north side, nearer the spring. Experiment with what'll grow in more shade." "Write it down," Gideon said. Levi was already writing. Gideon looked at the cliff home, the wooden door, the stone wall, the lantern light showing through the gap between door and frame, and felt the last of the old weight lift off his shoulders. Not all at once. In the way that settled things do, gradually and then completely. His father had known. He had always known. He had simply been waiting for them to know it too. In the morning, Levi opened the door of the cliff home and stepped out into the early light with the milk pail in his hand. The canyon was still and gold and smelled of damp soil and sage. The cabbage heads were dark green against the pale stone. Pip was already awake and watching him from behind the barn door with enormous patience. He set the pail down for a moment and looked at all of it. The garden, the rock, the sky above the canyon walls. The way a person looks at something they know they will still be looking at in 30 years. Then he picked up the pail and went to begin the day.